Namaste. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat. My name is Abhishek Nayapati and I will be your host today. I have a very special guest with me today. His name is Yogi Trivedi ji, and he's here to speak about his latest book, In Love at Ease, in which he details his life experiences with his guru, Pramukh Swami Maharaj ji. With further ado, here's Mr. Yogi ji. Namaste, Mr. Yogi ji. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be on with you. Thank you, Abhishek.
I hope you're doing well. And of course, can you give us a little background about what made you actually write this book? You've known your Guruji for your entire life. And what is it that made you want to write this book at this time?
I start the book off by saying I took my first steps and had my first fall in my Guru's presence. And I think for me, in this case, it was Pramukh Swami, but all spiritual masters, they're walking partners in life. They're with you in difficulty. They're with you in sickness and in good health, when you're laughing and experiencing joy, but also when you're having a tough time. And I think my experience with a spiritual master, specifically Pramukh Swami in this case, was that his sort of humanly divine presence was felt even when he was not around me. Those lessons of spirituality, the memories that I had of him, whether it was love, his teachings, interactions with him, of how he was experiencing the world around him, but also how he was interacting with other human beings, other living beings, with nature. So I think all of those sort of lessons, and when the centennial celebrations came around and Penguin said to me, hey, we'd love for you to, Penguin Random House that is, said we'd love for you to write something for us for the 100-year celebrations of Pramukh Swamiji.
Okay.
I said, let's do it, because it seems like I've had a lot of interactions with him and I would love to share those. But also I've been witness to his interactions with tens of thousands of people. So that close proximity balanced with the distance I've had from him. And that distance is twofold. When I speak of distance, I'm talking about not just distance as physical, because clearly I had spent a lot of time with him in proximity, but I also lived in New York, so I wasn't always with him, and I wasn't always able to travel with him, though I did that quite often. The second distance is the sort of distance that we put in between ourselves and a community. So as a scholar of religion and as a former journalist, we wear these different caps. These different caps sometimes encourage us to be objective, or to put some sort of intellectual or sociological distance between the people who we write about, the community that we study. And in my case, my PhD is in the study of the Swaminarayan community and Gujarat specifically. So that distance also, so that balance of sort of being so close to him and the community, and the sort of distance that I had as a scholar and a journalist, gave me this perspective. I'd like to think it was unique, and I think it was that perspective that I thought I would share, because the balance of the proximity and the distance allows one to then speak of not just accomplishments, speak of not just achievements, but speak about how a person and a community is grounded. And that is, I think, what this book is about. In Love at Ease, Everyday Spirituality with Pramukh Swami, I don't just talk about him as a cultural ambassador. And in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, he did work as not just a Hindu, not just a Gujarati, but as an Indian cultural ambassador in East Africa, Europe, the UK, the Middle East, the Gulf states. I write about his interactions with Jewish rabbis and obviously the sheikhs and the leaders of the Muslim communities in the Arab world, but also in North America, where you and I are sitting today in America, and the kind of sort of cultural tolerance that he brought about by introducing the culture through festivals, the building of temples and mandirs specifically. BAPS has so many mandirs in North America, and each of those mandirs then becomes a place of interaction with people, right? So when you create this edifice, which is an architectural wonder in some cases, it is a spiritual wonder in some cases, but also becomes a hub for humanitarian and cultural spiritual activities for the Hindu diaspora in the local community. it sort of builds, or it starts building bridges with local communities and people who know nothing about India or Gujarat or Hinduism. And so I think those contributions have been talked about often. But what hasn't been talked about, Abhishek ji, is how those contributions were achieved, how Pramukh Swamiji was able to achieve all of that and yet stay grounded and maintain that sort of human element in his interactions. And I think that is the crux of the book. The crux of the book is how can one achieve and at the same time be eyeless? Eyeless, meaning humble. How can one really love and at the same time be detached and not be attached to one's actions or people in a way that is detrimental to their growth and one's own spiritual growth? How can one belong to a particular community? You know, so when someone sees the cover of this book, I was just in India for about 4.5 months getting the book off the ground. And I would see the book often in airports or bookstores when I'm traveling. And I would watch people interact with the cover of the book, not with the book, but with the cover of the book. And I'd see people would say like, oh, that's a saffron-clad Hindu monk, or someone who know a little more would say, oh, that's a Gujarati Swami Narayan monk, you know, or that's Pramukh Swami. We know what he's done. Oh, great, good for him. But the book is not for me, right? Because we have these inherent biases in our mind. But I felt that my spiritual leader, Pramukh Swamiji, was able to transcend his own identity as the leader of a Swaminarayan community, of an organization, of a Hindu monk, or from someone being from Gujarat in India, and sort of really connect with the world. And I think that balance of embracing all and yet being grounded in a tradition. So I think these are all the factors, sort of long-winded answer to your first question. What inspired you to write the book? I thought that these lessons, this sort of groundedness in everyday spirituality is something I witnessed with my guru. And I thought that this would be the perfect chance to sort of bring it out for the people within the community, the youngsters, but also those without who don't know about Swamiji's life as a spiritual master.
I see. So you have a very unique perspective in that sense that you've had firsthand experience with Swamiji, but you're approaching it kind of as a journalist and as a research paper. So you can kind of, in a way, be a little detached from it, but also you have that personal connection. So I think that gives a nice perspective. So before we go a little more into the book, I think we need to understand the background of the Swaminarayana Sampradaya. So how did it start? I believe it was during, India was still under British rule at this time, and it was kind of a social reformist movement. So what was the climate like during that time that led to the Sampradaya being started?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So the Swaminarayan Sampradaya started in, I'd say, the late 17th, early 18th century. Bhagwan Swaminarayan, traveled he was born and raised in North India. Then he traveled, the hagiographies of the community say that he traveled around the subcontinent and settled in Gujarat.
Okay.
And that is where the community grew in Saurashtra and then later in central Gujarat, where, yes, social reform was an important part of what he did. I think people don't know about the contributions of Bhagwan Swaminarayan or Sri Swaminarayan in the early part of the time. So, yes, there was an interaction with the British. The British did see that there was a similar sort of social reform that they wanted to bring about in India, but Sri Swaminarayan was doing it under a different rubric, a different system, and yet he was doing it quite effectively and efficiently. He was changing lives, not changing religion or sectarian communities. So not conversion, but converting people from within. And I think that is something that was different in the model that was being used by the British and then obviously being used by Sri Swaminarayan himself. But those early contributions of Sati Pratha, which was a big thing at the time, where young women whose husbands died of natural causes or whatnot at an early age were sort of, encouraged is the wrong word, almost forced to burn themselves on the funeral pyre and the cremation pyre. Often young women were often drowned in bowls of milk, and it was called the Dudh Piti Pratha, or tradition, in which, because people were afraid of dowry, or having to pay dowry in 10, 15, 20 years when their young daughters got married, they would do something like this. And so Sri Swaminarayan came in and said, all of this needs to stop. This is not rooted in the tradition that we belong to. This is this sort of perversion of that tradition, and we need to stop it now. So I think those are the kinds of things, these are just 2 or 3 of the ones I mentioned. He was one of the first to sort of in Gujarat say, we need to really ameliorate the effects or lessen the effects of the social caste system or the class system. And so that was something that he took on head on. Many British historians and people who have, so even people from the East India Company and the British Raj who interacted with Swaminarayan and his followers would say that, notice that there were people from all castes there. In fact, the first time Sri Swaminarayan met with the governor of Mumbai, he brought people from various castes and even someone from the Musalman community or the Muslim community to show that, a religious community does not have to be bound by these sort of rigidities that we sort of say. People can easily be who they want to be while still belonging within a community of love, service, equality, and spirituality. And I think that was the essence of Sri Swaminarayan's sort of what you would call social reform. I would say spiritual and social reform in that moment. And I think it was that legacy that after almost about 200 years, 170, 180 years, Pramukh Swamiji continued and sort of, I would say, rejuvenated, right? Because the legacy had continued, and there were great monks and sadhus in many of the different lineages that continued after Sri Swaminarayan in Gujarat and in the Gujarati diaspora. But what Pramukh Swamiji was able to do, I'd say from probably the early 70s up until his passing away in 2016, was really bring about this cultural, social, spiritual, humanitarian renaissance in what the Swaminarayan Sampradaya, BAPS, and then I would take it a step further, because this kind of kindness, this kind of love, this kind of everyday spirituality is contagious, Abhishekji. And so when he was traveling around the world, when he was interacting with Jains, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Muslims, non-believers, people from all backgrounds, that sort of spirituality rubbed off on them. And I think that that sort of infectious spirituality, if I may use that term, was something that made its way around the world and specifically around Gujarat, India, and the Indian diaspora around the world. So I think this is the context for the Swaminarayan community and the founder, and then later Pramukh Swami. And in the book, what I try to do is try to provide some of that context through the incidents and interactions that I share of Pramukh Swami without actually making it a textbook. The other book you see on the bookshelf next to mine, published by Oxford University Press, is called Swaminarayan Hinduism, Tradition, Adaptation, Identity, which is more of a academic reader where someone can go to get more sort of substantial answers about the questions that you're asking. But in this book, I try to provide that context background for a lay reader who does not have any understanding of Gujarat, India, Hinduism even, or the Swaminarayan community. But the interactions provide that context. Swamiji's spirituality provides that context.
So I love that answer, because that actually leads me into my next question. So you kind of touched on it, that it was the infectious spirituality, the way as you described. So pretty much the question I want to ask is, what really made Pramukh Swamiji unique? In the sense that, because there's many Gurujis out there that have knowledge, right? But it was his ability to maybe communicate, or because he had such an impact on people from different communities, and even he met with so many world leaders, which I don't think every Guruji could do that. So what was it about him that was unique? Was it the way he communicated? Was it his aura? What was it about him?
So I think all spiritual leaders are unique and special in their own way, right? We find what we want on that path of spirituality, and I believe that there's some divine force that puts us in touch with the spiritual master, who can guide us in the way of the prescription that we need on the spiritual path. So that I think that is the sort of starting point of how I would answer your question. But what was unique about Swamiji and what I noticed, so I've traveled to over 70 countries. I've interacted with over 1,000 religious gurus, Dharma gurus, from all parts of the world and all different backgrounds. I think the one thing that stood out to me about Swamiji, and that does to me about other spiritual leaders who also work in the same way that Swamiji did, was his ability to touch humans. And when I say touch, I don't mean physically, but yes, physically, because I mean, if you think of the amount of written letters and emails that he answered, over 700, 800,000. I've traveled with him often when I was handling his English letter correspondence, and we'd get letters from everything from where should my daughter go to school, or where should I go to college, to I'm digging a well in this village, and here's the map of my farmland. Where should I sort of dig the well to make sure that I get enough water from my farms, and from my home. So now these kinds of questions were so diverse, from questions about going to an Ivy League school to farming, and Swamiji, with patience, with love, would answer each question, and later on email. Often there were times when the people would send letters, and the handwriting was penmanship was unable to be understood or comprehended, and yet he would make an effort. He would toil with that letter for like days and days and days, hours and hours and hours, trying to make something out of it. Sometimes letters would come without addresses, and he would call monks sadhus traveling in that region, and say, can you find out, go to that village, Gao, and find out who it is that we can speak to find out maybe where this letter came from, or who from that family may have written this letter. So that kind of human touch, which he never lost, even when the organization grew, even when his community grew, where everyone sitting in that crowd could look into his eyes and feel that my guru is speaking to me even in that silence, is something that that spoke to me the most about him. That sort of one-on-one interaction with people he was perhaps meeting for the first time, perhaps meeting even just for 5, 10, 15 seconds. The perfect example, if I may use from the book, I was speaking to one of the monks who used to travel with him, Nirbhay Swami, and he told me that Swamiji was going to be felicitated at the Canadian Parliament in Canada, in Ottawa. And right before the Parliament felicitation, they were driving to there. Everyone in the car was elated about what was about to happen. Their guru, probably one of the first times a Hindu guru like this in the 80s was going to be felicitated in a Canadian Parliament, or at the Canadian Parliament. And Swamiji was indifferent. He was sitting in the car. He was reading a letter, and as he was reading a letter, he had kicked off one of his slippers, right? Because he had put his leg on top of the other, and he was really trying to decipher the handwriting, the penmanship of one of his devotees. And as that was going on, one of the monks said, "Put the letter down. We're going to the Canadian Parliament." And he goes, "No, my job is to do seva, is to serve. So this is my seva. When I enter the Canadian Parliament, it's my seva to accept that." And he read that letter until the last minute the car pulled up to the sort of entrance that they were supposed to use. And as he put the letter down and he was getting out, he did not even remember that his slipper had been kicked off. He walked out without one of his slippers, and the monk pulled it out and he said, "Swamiji, we need both of our slippers to go into the Parliament." He laughed and he said, but he was so engrossed in connecting with that human being. Who knows where that letter was from? Maybe some village in Gujarat or Maharashtra or Rajasthan, right? And yet that was as important to him. That human interaction was as important to him as being felicitated at the Canadian Parliament. So I think these are the kinds of interactions that spoke to me. I speak about so many of my own personal interactions in the book where I felt that, when I was 5 years old and Swamiji apologized to me, or when I had a jaundice when I was traveling with him and he sort of took over my medical treatment when I was traveling with him in Gujarat at the time. So that kind of human touch. There are times when he would tell me not to take up volunteering tasks with the community because He was worried about what was good for my career and my financial stability, right? So what kind of a leader puts his community or his organization on the back burner to care about a person and to be so upfront about it? And that's why I think he was unique, he was special. And that's why I think that groundedness in everyday spirituality is why he was able to achieve outwardly, inwardly, and then in his interactions with other human beings.
I love the example you shared about the Canadian Parliament, because I think that's, it's something we can all apply in our lives. If we do achieve success, right, if we get really successful in whatever it is that we do, you're never too big to talk to everyday people. So I think that's kind of the lesson I could take from that. But so what I want to go into now is in the book, there's an incident where you detailed some troubles you were having in your life, and you were seeking advice from Swamiji. And the quote right here that he says, he let you explain the whole scenario, and then he says, okay, tell me what happened again, but then tell me without telling me how you feel. So explain the whole situation, but keep your feelings out of it. So can you kind of explain that scenario, and what was the wisdom he was trying to impart on you in that moment?
Yeah. And I think that's why the cover often is misleading, right? So you look at the cover and you're like, oh, it's a biography of this Swaminarayan Hindu Gujarati monk. But what I've tried to do is really find these tidbits of everyday spirituality that have nothing to do with a religion, with a community, with a group of people, or even a Hindu monk, but actually speak universally, timelessly to people. And I think that is it. That was and that's why I use it as one of the sort of foundational incidents in the introduction that sets the trajectory for the book, where, I was having a really difficult time. I felt like people were not understanding me. I was being misunderstood. It was affecting my mental, my spiritual, my physical health. And I went to go meet him in Mumbai. And I went in and I was like, whew, like I was just letting it out. When you see your mom or your father or your better half after however many hours, months, weeks, whatever, and you just need to let it all out. And I was letting it out in front of my guru, and he listened. He let me vent for a while, and then he said to me in Gujarati, so then I can get the translation to you. He goes, "Shant Teja," meaning calm down. Shu thayu, what happened? Mandine વાત કર. Tell me from the beginning. પણ અત્યારે તારા જે હૃદયનો ભાવ છે, but the emotion that you feel within your heart is getting in the way of me understanding what happened. Leave that out. And so I translated that loosely in the book because I think it's a very powerful quote, and I think it captures the essence of what he's saying. I say, tell me what happened without telling me how you feel. And I think if we can, I was just thinking about that while I was writing the introduction, and I said, darn, this is the answer to so many of our problems in our interactions at home, at work, in our professional careers and settings, in our social settings with extended family and relatives and family friends, childhood friends. We really, or even at a coffee shop, at a barista, when you're interacting with a barista, someone messes up the coffee, right? The simple problem is what? Someone messed up a product that you paid for. And we all of a sudden get into how we were feeling that morning, what had happened right before we walked into the coffee shop. All of that weighs in, or how that person looks, their appearance, or what their cultural or ethnic or religious background may be. All of that baggage sort of weighs in on the situation, where all we perhaps could do to solve the issue is smile and say, can we try this coffee again? It doesn't work for me, or it tastes burnt, and I'd really appreciate it, since we paid for it. I'd really appreciate if we can try to get it right. That's all. And with a smile, if you say that, I don't know how many baristas in New York City or wherever you are around the world would say no, right? But what do? We bring in all that baggage of how we're feeling and what has happened that day to sort of into that situation. And I think my guru was teaching me how to solve my problem with ordering coffee, but also more intensely taking on life's bigger problems, whether I'm not married, but whether they're marital problems, whether they're with our children. And I think just that one sentence can change so many of our days, of our minutes, of our moments in life. And so that is what I've tried to capture from my interactions with him and share with him in the share with the reader in the book.
No, I really love that quote because it really put things into perspective because it's like your emotions are valid in many cases. You're allowed to have them. That's why it seemed like he let you kind of vent. And then he's like, you know what? But if we're going to solve this problem, you have to put your emotions out of it. You have to objectively, okay, what actually happened? And also people understand you better if you're just sort of you're just, objectively explaining what happened. So I love that part of the book.
And it changes the way you articulate, right? That's the key. Emotions often get in the way of articulating in a way that is open to being received or accepted by others. Because anger, sarcasm, tonal inflection, all of that which comes with a lot of negative emotion can get in the way of someone being open to receiving what you're trying to say, no matter how valid it is.
Yeah, I agree. That's wonderful. So now let's get into the book a little more. In the second chapter, it's titled "In Love, Bhakti Personified." So before, I think first, can you kind of define what exactly is bhakti, or how would Guru Pramukh Swamiji define bhakti?
Yeah, so in this book, I've sort of expanded the definition of bhakti. If you think of the word bhakti in where it comes from in Sanskrit, it comes from the verbal root bhaj, which literally means to share, to participate, to eat, to love. I mean, it can mean, Sanskrit, so you know that a verbal root can have so many different definitions in the way that it's sort of developed over at least two, maybe more, thousands of years of literature and spoken usage, right? And so I think bhaj can mean all of those things. But what we do when we talk about bhakti in the sort of modern Hindu context, often we sort of limit it to devotion, worship, prayer, ritual. But inherent to this idea of bhakti is interaction, is participation, is a sense of sang, satsang, or community. And I think in this book, when I talk about bhakti, I expand. It's not something new I'm doing. I'm expanding to the sort of original understandings of what bhakti may have meant to the great acharyas of the bhakti traditions of the past, to talk about bhakti in a way that really is otherworldly, but also worldly. And I think that is how I use bhakti in the chapter, the second chapter of the book, to say bhakti as love personified, right? Or bhakti personified is essentially loving the world, loving the self, and loving God and Guru. These are three sort of foundations of bhakti. What do we mean by loving the world? If one, I've heard this from my Guru so many times, if Jya juo tya Ramaji biju na bhasere, meaning wherever you look, you see Ramji, or you see the divine, Sri Ram, or more generically, God. You see the divine everywhere you look, in the books behind me, in this computer in front of me, in the host that I'm speaking to now, but also someone who might scruff my car in the parking lot in a few hours later, right? So if that kind of vision is there, it sort of changes the way you can inherently have love for the world around you. So I think that is the essence of bhakti, but not just for humans. I talk about in the book how Pramukh Swami loved animals and the kinds of steps he took to provide for animals as well. We could get into, the famine relief work he did. He did not run famine or drought relief camps. He essentially ran homes for animals, which he visited despite being the leader of such a large organization. And he would essentially try to find the weakest animals in the camp and see how he could make them feel better, how he could provide for them with the limited resources that were available in the 80s and 90s, in the sort of worst famines of modern Indian history at the time, right? So I think these are the sort of lessons of love that I think bhakti truly tries to signify or capture. And then, or the word bhakti, at least the concept bhakti. And then, of course, we talk about self-love. Now, in the world we live in, we talk about self-love in a way that can mean go getting a manicure and pedicure, is having me time, or is getting a massage, or going on a hike or trek. And I'm not against any of those things. Everyone needs to recover, rejuvenate, But I think that is sort of just scratching the surface. What I learned from my guru was that self-love was not just loving Yogi out here in what he's wearing or making sure there's beard oil in my beard, the things that I do to take care of my body, but to go further within and love the true self, wherever it is in the body, the Atman. And so when I talk about self-love in the context of my guru, I'm talking about loving the inner self, the true self, Atmanishta, is realizing that the only way you can love the world is if you love the divine that is within your Atman. And once you generate the power from within, then taking on interacting with the world becomes a piece of cake. So, and then obviously the more sort of widely understood definition of Guru Bhakti,
Right.
love and admiration for the Guru, but also then for God. And so that is how I try to capture. And it talks everything. It talks about everything from environmentalism to daily interactions of love and how we can learn to love in a selfless sort of practical way. So that is, I think, the essence of the chapter is to be able to see the divine in all those around you, treat them as you would treat the divine, and share that infectious love.
Okay, so that's actually interesting. So can you kind of, because you talk also about how, okay, so you have to love the self and the true self, but you also have to kind of live with the I-less, as you touched on before. So can you kind of help us understand that? Because how do you kind of disassociate with the self, but also love the self, if you understand what I'm saying?
I think it's part of the same journey. So if you're
Okay.
loving the world, if you're loving God and Guru, and you're loving the Atman within you, you start disassociating with your external identity. So it's important. When I used to teach at Columbia Journalism, I'd get up in front of my class and I would say, "Okay, what do you see in your professor today?" And start making a list of the markers of how you would identify me. And almost everything about me on the first day of class was about how I looked, how I dressed, how I walked, how I spoke, because they'd only had a very limited 1 hour interaction with me thus far, right? I do that same exercise about 6 weeks into the semester. And now it's more about how I write emails, how I speak, how I might think a little, how I might approach things, because now they have a better understanding of who their professor is like. But now my argument is, what if you get past the body and the mind and you realize that you're the self within? And once you do that, then becoming I-less becomes very easy. So not only do you have the strength to achieve, to become, to affect change in society that you want to do, that so many of us want to do in a positive way, but you do it in a way that leaves room for others. If you remember the title of the book, Abhishek Ji, the chapter, Abhishek Ji, it's I-less, a bold identity, and then it has a lowercase I.
Okay.
So it essentially means that you have to achieve, you have to have this bold identity that can affect change and make a difference, but you have to do it by leaving your own ego, your own sense of a capital I. Like Yogi is someone, Yogi is something, whether it's the body, the mind, his achievements, his accomplishments, his wealth. I mean, right? We all have a sense of identity. We all draw that pride from somewhere, that sense of ego from somewhere.
Right.
And I'm saying that Pramukh Swami drew that sense of power, pride, and ego from within and not from his external identity and his external achievements and accomplishments. And that's why he was able to accommodate. That's why he was able to adjust. That's why he was able to tolerate insult. That's why he was able to smile and apologize to a 5-year-old boy who had no idea of what was going on in that moment when his guru apologized to him. So I think all of those things happen on the journey. Now, may I take on your next question, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure.
Without you asking.
Yes.
So now, if you're in love with the world and the self and the divine, it changes the way you interact with the world, right? Once you do that, it leaves room for others to join you on the journey. So you don't have this bold sense of ego or identity that does not allow room for others to grow with you. So now you're in love, you're I-less. The next step is, if you're in love and you're doing it in a way that is humble and without this bold, boisterous ego, then you can embrace all. Then you do not see a differentiation in those who are above you, who are with you, who are under you. In fact, you don't see that hierarchy in the way that the world sees it. We talk about equality often, Abhishekji.
Yeah.
And we talk about equality in a way, in this idealistic fashion, this sense. And it's a wonderful thing. But in the 3, 4, 5, 2,000 years of modern, of human civilization, we know that that kind of equality has not been achieved yet, right? Where everyone is in that utopian world. There are systems, there are structures, there is a hierarchy always. But now, what if there was a way to sort of, if you can't completely dissolve that hierarchy, what if there was a way to live within that hierarchy where you're not insulting others, where you're not offending others, where you're not marginalizing or diminishing their voice or ignoring them or not noticing them, but because you're in love and you're eyeless, you're able to embrace everyone because your heart and your mind does not have corners. So I think that is the spiritual journey where you can embrace all. And so in that next chapter, which is called Embracing All, I talk about how Pramukh Swami knew that equality had to be achieved from within and had to be done where he had to live it, not just advocate for it from the top. So when it came to Dalit interactions, when it came to Adivasi interactions, when it came to interactions with people of the opposite gender, caste, creed, color, religion, whatever, he almost did not see the difference in the way he interacted with them. That's not to say he did not see a change in skin color or a change in the outward external identities of a Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Jain, but he taught lessons of love and spirituality that allowed everyone in that room to be together in a way that fostered a community of love, spirituality, and warmth. And I think so when you're in love and you do it in a way that is eyeless and all-embracing, that brings us to the last chapter, which is it puts you at ease. There's no need to project. There's no need to project. There's no need to pretend. You can be who you are. You can cry the way you want. You can laugh the way you want. You can eat what you want. There's a sense of easy spirituality that does not need to be pretentious or performed. It just becomes everyday. And I think that's what the last chapter does. It talks about how Pramukh Swami laughed and joked and smiled and cried and would often even discipline someone if he had to with the right intention. But how he was able to teach that lesson and then detach himself from how he felt in that moment, right? So there wasn't an anger in that sense. He would use a stern voice if he had to. But about 3 seconds later, there was no anger, there was no grudge. So I think, and then finally, the last chapter of At Ease is something, or the last section, the last lesson of At Ease is something we all struggle with, is how to take on age, retirement, illness, and of course, death, right? Not in a morbid way, but it's one of the only things that are certain in life, right? That we must go one day. And I use Pramukh Swami's sort of old age and the way he accepted the next chapter of Bhakti and Seva as a way of how the everyday spiritual being can sort of interact or engage or embrace the idea of death in a way that's not morbid, but can be done with a smile, with a sense of ease, with a sense of calmness and satisfaction. So I think that is the journey of everyday spirituality in the book. One more time, if you're in love, and you're in love in the way that is eyeless and all-embracing, you can be at ease. And if you're at ease, then you're grounded in everyday spirituality. You find that balance, which then allows for you to affect the change in the world that the way Pramukh Swamiji did.
Oh, thank you so much for that. That was just like a beautiful explanation. I could tell this means a lot to you too, so I appreciate your time. One thing I want to share, honestly, is a quote from the book. You said, "He built bridges that made the world smaller and people's hearts larger." He did not just talk about social justice, he lived it. So can you explain what you mean by that? Because today there's a lot of talk about social justice, and I think you touched on a little bit about, embracing all. What do you mean by he did not just talk about social justice, he lived it?
That's a great question. I didn't go into detail earlier, but that's what I was trying to get at, where, you can talk about equality I'm associated with an Ivy League school, and we sort of often, and I take it upon myself, not on my colleagues, but upon myself, where we often interact or advocate for things or talk and preach this equality that we don't ourselves necessarily live.
Yeah.
Pramukh Swami was different. Pramukh Swami did not advocate from some ivory tower. He went and lived with the people. He loved the people for whom he advocated. There's also another beautiful sentence in the book where I talk about Pramukh Swami as a person who was one of the only people, right? One of the Dalit gurus says that he was one of the only people that did not just ask us to his ashrams or his mandirs for photo opportunities, but he came and lived with us. He visited our straw huts and our mud huts. He ate with us. He lived with us. He spent nights in huts in Adivasi or tribal villages that the average urban dweller or average rural dweller in Gujarat or Maharashtra or Rajasthan or anywhere in India would not. So he practiced what he preached. He lived and loved in the way that he wanted to see the society living and loving. And so I think that is why he was such a powerful role model. That is why he was such a special role model, because he did so from within. Right. And I think, and then the last point to what you just asked is that he did it in a way that united society and did not divide them, right? So it's easy to talk about equality and focus on the external markers, and then causes these lines, these sort of fault lines that cannot be mended and healed. And those divisions in society often hurt more than the actual structure of division and inequality itself, because now people have a bias, a grudge for even their neighbor who may not have done anything bad to them, right? So when you see the way different people of religious backgrounds interact, or people of different social backgrounds, there's this inherent, the Sanskrit word would be grina, or hatred for someone, because you're like, oh, someone is from that background. And Pramukh Swami tried to build bridges of people between people of different backgrounds, and he tried to sort of mend those borders and divisions so that people would come together, so that people would live together. And I think one of the most powerful examples, there's so many in the book that I talk about, is the Akshardham response. So in the early 2000s, there was a terrorist attack on the Akshardham Mandir in Gandhinagar, which is the capital city of Gujarat. And I interviewed Brigadier General Raj Sitapati, who was the commander, the Black Cat, the commander of the Black Cat Commando forces that came in from New Delhi to work on the operation, and also one of the leading journalists of Gujarat. His name was Ajay Umat. He was the he was there covering the story from essentially from the start to the finish, and even the sort of follow-ups. And both of them said something that really, really I think about to this day. They said that Pramukh Swami was not the leader of the Swaminarayan community. He was not the president of BAPS. In that moment, he was the spiritual conscience of Gujarat, the larger Hindu community, and India. Taking a step in one way, a gesture in one direction, one word of sort of inflammatory rhetoric could have set all of Gujarat and India into flames. But what Pramukh Swami did instead was not focus on what had happened, but rather focus on how he could bridge the divide between the different communities, how he could move forward, how he could provide for those who were hurt during the terrorist attack, and how he could focus on peace in the region, state, and in the nation. And so I think these lessons of equality are more powerful when they're lived, when we can actually see them in people's lives, as opposed to just being heard about or talked about or read about in books and lectures. Does that make sense?
Of course. It's amazing. I love that answer. So I think lastly, I just want to say, is there any closing remarks you would like to make? I believe I think it's important to highlight that all the proceeds from the books is actually going to a Adivasi community, which I think Pramukh Swamiji was very close to. So if you want to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think that is the sort of the last word that I would like to have, the infamous last word, is that, that's just one small thing. All the sort of royalties proceeds from the book will be donated through the trust to Adivasi education and healthcare in Poshina, Gujarat. It was a community, one of many communities that Pramukh Swami had traveled in to a great extent and quite frequently. At the age of 89, Pramukh Swami had fought with his medical doctors and attendants to go to that remote village of Poshina and meet 10,000 of those Adivasi villagers. Just a small tidbit of fact, he had said, what do they like to eat? He had asked his attendant, and they had said that in that community, they like to eat shido or halwa, but they make it with oil. So Swamiji said, they make it with oil because ghee is expensive. I want to make sure that we make shido for all 10,000 of them with pure or shuddha ghee, right? Chokhu ghee. In Gujarati, we would say chokhu ghee. So that is how close he was to these communities. I find that he was someone that gave voice to those who often were silenced, and he heard those who were often ignored, and saw those who were often ignored in a room. And I think in the sort of the continuation of that tradition of his legacy, we decided to make all of the proceeds from the book available to the community for its education and healthcare. But I think the overall essence of the book is to look beyond who we are, just as a Hindu community or a spiritual community or a religious community or a nationality or a skin color or a gender, and really try to think in a universal, timeless way of how we can interact with others to change the world. What we try to do often is change the world through policy, through our words, through activities or initiatives. And those are all great things because they do affect change. But nothing affects change in the way that we live, the way that we act, the way that we speak with those around us. And I think that is the lesson of the book. And I hope people not just from Gujarat or India or the Indian diaspora engage with the book. I hope that people pick it up and try to find those gems of spirituality, everyday universal spirituality from Pramukh Swami's life that speak to people from across religious, social, and ethnic and national borders. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.